Welcome back to the Simulator series. In today's episode, we're going to be implementing the auto-clicker game pass along with a couple of other game passes that we haven't implemented previously. Now, to begin implementing the auto-clicker game pass, we'll start on the server side. So, to implement this on the server side, we're going to go inside of the server script service, and we're going to go ahead and open up the auto-click server script. Inside of here, along with all of our other module variables, we're going to want to create another one, and this is actually going to be for the shop config. Now, we can look at our update auto-clicker function if we want to remember how the auto-clicker is set up in our player's data. So we have two different types of auto-clickers, the fast and the regular one. And inside of our player's data, we have a table called auto. And inside of that table, we have both the fast and the regular auto clicker, which also are tables. And those tables have a property called active and a property called duration. Now, whenever the player activates their auto clicker, the active property is set to true. And the duration property is set based on how much time the player has left before their auto clicker expires. Now, with our implementation of how the auto clicker game pass is going to work is if the player has this game pass, then what we're going to do is basically ignore the duration of the player's auto clicker and no longer take that into account. So even if the player has 0 duration for their auto clicker, if they purchase the game pass, then they're still going to be able to have their auto clicker active and running entirely. So inside of the update auto clicker function, we're going to create a new variable, which is going to be called has game pass. And of course, we're going to use the shop config variable that we just added here, and then we're going to use the does player own game pass function. Now, our game pass is named permanent auto clicker. Of course, if yours is named different, then make sure you add the exact name here. And on top of that, we're going to pass through the player's profile data. So now that we know if the player has the game pass or not, what we're then going to do is update the duration variable right here. Now, instead of setting the player's duration specifically to the duration of their auto clicker, what we're going to do is we're going to check if they own the game pass. And if they do own the game pass, then what we're going to do is set the duration to 999. Otherwise, we're going to set the duration to whatever their actual duration is of that specific auto clicker. So now that we've updated this duration code, whenever a player tries to activate their auto clicker from the client side and tells the server, hey, I want to activate this auto clicker, if the player owns the game pass, then we're no longer going to worry about their actual duration. Instead, we're just going to set that to 999 so that this if statement can be true, and then we'll activate the player's auto clicker. Now that we've updated activating the auto clicker, we also have to update some of the logic that comes with implementing the auto clicker and rewarding the player for their auto clicks. So now inside of this while loop, we can actually remove two variables because it turns out we stopped using them and forgot to delete them. The two variables that we can delete are the regular duration as well as the fast duration. Now, after we actually get the player's profile, we're going to create another variable, and this is going to be the same variable that we created up here, which is has game pass, to check if the player actually owns our auto clicker game pass. Now that we know if the player has the game pass or not, the logic that we have to update is a little bit further down, and this is the actual line that we need to update. Now, this line right here is where we actually check if the player's auto clicker should resume operating as normal, or if we should shut the auto clicker down because the player has ran out of that specific auto clicker's time. So to make this code run for only the players which do not own that specific game pass, all we have to say is and not has game pass. So if the player has ran out of auto clicker time and they do not own the game pass, then we're going to go ahead and turn that auto clicker off, as well as notify the player on the client side. So now that we've done that for the fast auto clicker, we can also do it for the regular auto clicker as well. And all we have to do is come down to this if statement right here and add the exact same code as well. So and not has game pass. So now that we've updated the logic in all three locations inside of the script, we're pretty much done with implementing this on the server side. And now we just have to add that logic to the client side. Now, to begin implementing this on the client side, we need to go ahead and find the script that contains all of the logic for the auto clickers. And this is actually one of the last scripts which is stored inside of our starter GUI because we actually forgot to move that one into the starter player / starter player scripts and into our GUI folder. So what we're going to do is go inside of the starter GUI. We're then going to go into the ClickButtons GUI, and inside of here, we have a local script called manager. Now, what we're going to do is actually rename this, and I'm going to rename this to be called clicker buttons. And then I'm going to go ahead and move this script into our GUI folder inside of the starter player scripts. Now that we have that inside of there, we can go ahead and close all of these other directories, and then we can go ahead and open up the script. Now that we've moved this script into a different location, we also have to update some of its existing variables. So what I'm going to do is create a variable for the player service, and I'll also create a variable for the marketplace service as well. In addition to that, we're also going to want to get the shop config. So that's of course inside of the replicated storage, inside the configs folder, and that module script is named shop. Now that we've created that, we also want to create a variable for the local player, which we're going to call player. So players.localPlayer. And then we'll also want to create a variable for the player's GUI, which is going to be inside inside of the player object, and then we'll say .player GUI. Now that we have that, we're going to go ahead and update the GUI variable. We're going to use the player's GUI, and then we're actually going to use wait for child and wait for the click bunch GUI to be generated. And now with all the changes that we've just made to the script, if we did start up our game, it should load perfectly fine as it did previously. Again, we only needed to make those changes simply because we moved the script from one directory to another. Anyways, the next thing that we can do is actually remove two variables from here because it turns out we don't actually use them, and we probably forgot to delete them whenever we updated the system previously. So we can go ahead and delete both of those. And now that we've deleted both of those, we can also delete where we set those inside of our update button function as well. So delete that one along with that one. Now, implementing this logic on the client side is relatively easy. We're going to scroll almost all the way down to the bottom of our script, and we want to actually go to where we script clicking on the fast auto button. Now, of course, you can implement this in a different way that you want to. How I'm going to implement this is whenever the player clicks the fast auto button, what we're going to do is check if they own the Game Pass. Now, if they do own the Game Pass, then we're going to go ahead and tell the server to activate the auto clicker. If they don't own the Game Pass, then we're going to go ahead and prompt the player to purchase the Game Pass for this auto clicker. So what we'll do is start off by creating a variable inside of here called Game Pass ID. And we're going to use the shop config to actually get that. So we'll use the get Game Pass ID from name function. And of course, the name of our Game Pass that we're looking for is called permanent auto clicker. Now that we've gotten that Game Pass ID, we then want to create a variable to check if the player actually owns the Game Pass. And of course, to do that, we'll use the does player own Game Pass function, in which we'll first pass through the Game Pass ID, and then we'll pass through the state manager.getData as well. Now, like I said, if the player does have the Game Pass, then what do we want to do? Well, we're just going to do what we've always done inside of this function. So we're just going to go ahead and tell the server to toggle that auto clicker on. But now if the player does not own that Game Pass, then what we want to do is prompt the player to purchase that Game Pass. So we're going to use the marketplace service. We'll use the prompt Game Pass purchase method. We'll pass through the player, and we'll pass through the Game Pass ID that we want to prompt the player to purchase. And now that's actually all we have to do to implement this on the client side. So if we hop into our game and then we turn the fast auto clicker on, we can see that it's working perfectly, and we can let our game run forever, and we would see that the fast auto clicker never actually runs out because we do own that Game Pass. So the next Game Pass that we're going to implement is the unlimited Rebirths button inside of the Rebirths menu. Now, implementing this is going to be fairly easy. We actually don't have to do anything on the server side, but what we are going to do is start off by updating the Rebirths config. So we're going to go inside of the replicated storage, inside of the configs folder, and open up the Rebirths module. Inside of here, we should have a function called calculate price. Now, I believe in a previous episode, we actually updated this function to use a different method of calculating the price, which does not involve using a while loop. Although for some reason, in my code, I still have this exact same method in here. So I'm not sure if something got jumbled up and I used old code or something like that. But what I'm going to do is replace this function with the function that should be here. Now on screen is the function that we should actually be using. And if your function was the previous one that we had, then I would recommend updating that one to be exactly like this one on screen right now. Now, the reason that we swapped over to using this logic for this function is because it turns out that while loops are a very, very bad idea to use when the amount of loops can be a very, very large number. So for instance, if we're using this function and the amount of rebirths that we pass through to here is something like 100,000, then when we use our previous method, that while loop would have to iterate 100,000 times, which is a very, very, very inefficient way to handle that. Now, of course, when creating this originally, that's not something that I even thought of, but I definitely should have. Anyways, the current version of this function that we're using is a much better way of handling it. And I'm not 100% sure, but I think we might be able to technically say that we've optimized the previous method by over 100,000%, or of course, whatever number you would have thrown in as the amount of rebirths. Anyways, to get back to the subject of the video, above this function, we're going to create a brand new one. This function is going to be called getMaxRebirths, and it's going to accept the current rebirth, which of course is going to be a number, as well as clicks, which is also going to be a number as well. Now, we're going to be using this function to determine how many rebirths a player can actually purchase based on the amount of clicks that they have. Now, inside of this function, the first thing that we're going to do is create a variable called rebirths, and we're going to set that equal to 0. Now, after we've done that, we're also going to create a variable called I and set that equal to 1. Now, the I variable is short for iteration, as we're going to be using this inside of a loop to track how many iterations we've gone through so far. The next thing we'll do is create a while true loop. And now look, I know what you're already thinking, Monster, didn't you just go off about why you should not be using while loops? Don't worry, once we're done creating this function, I'll actually explain why using a while loop here is perfectly fine. Now inside of this loop, we're going to create another variable, which is going to be called cost. And that's actually going to be equal to the rebirths config, and we're going to use the calculate price method. For the arguments of this method, we're of course going to pass through the current rebirth, and then we'll also pass through I as well. Now, of course, the reason that we're passing through I is because that number is starting at 1. So with the first iteration, we're going to calculate the cost of rebirth rebirthing one single time. And now if you're still not getting it, the next thing that we'll do is increase the I variable by 1 every single time the while loop actually runs. So now this should paint you a better picture. Every single time the while loop iterates, the I variable is going to increase by 1, and every single time it increases by 1, we're going to be checking for the brand new cost. So with the first iteration, we'll check if the player is able to afford 1 rebirth. Then we'll check if the player is able to afford 2 rebirths, 3 rebirths, and increase the number every single iteration. Now, after we get the cost, we then want to see if the player can actually afford it. So we're going to create a variable called canAfford, which is going to be equal to the clicks being greater than the cost. Now, if the player is unable to afford it, then what we're going to do is break the loop. But we're also going to want to do something else if the player is actually able to afford it. Now, if the player is able to afford a rebirth, what we then want to do is actually update the rebirth variable to the current iteration of the loop. And that's actually all that we have to do for this entire while loop. But once this while loop is completed, we also want to do something as well. And what we actually want to do is return the rebirth variable. So we're returning the amount of rebirths that the player can actually afford. Okay, so now to explain why the while loop is perfectly fine to use here, but it was not fine to use in the calculate price function. One of the first reasons why the while loop is fine here is because we don't expect this loop to iterate an excessive amount of times. For instance, when we use the while loop inside of the calculate price function, that function could very easily iterate over 100,000 times. But when it comes to this while loop, we don't expect the player to actually be able to afford hundreds of thousands of rebirths. Now, depending on how your game is set up, if your players are able to afford an extremely excessive amount of rebirths at a single time, then you probably are going to have to refine this function a little bit to make it more adaptable for your system. Now, the second reason for why this while loop is fine to use in this function is because we're actually only going to be using this function on the client side. But when it comes to the client versus the server, of course, I want to keep everything on both the client and the server as safe as possible. But when it comes to the server side, I really prioritize keeping everything there as safe as possible, because if something breaks on the server side, you can have catastrophic issues which affect every single player currently in your game, compared to having client-side issues, which hopefully will only affect a very select number of users and maybe only a single user at a time. So if this function is causing one single client to stall, I'm much happier with that than this function causing an entire server to stall, and that most likely is going to happen in multiple games and all the servers that are currently going on, which is going to ruin every player's experience rather than only damaging one player's experience. Now again, overall, I don't think that's something that you have to worry about here. Like I said though, if your player is actually able to afford an excessive amount of rebirths, then this is something that you do want to consider and you may have to refine. Anyways, with that being said, we're now done with everything inside of the script, so we can go ahead and close it. The next thing that we'll do is start scripting the unlimited rebirth button that's inside of the rebirth menu. So to do this, we're going to go inside of the starter player, inside of the starter player scripts, inside of our GUI folder, inside of the rebirth folder, and open up the rebirth script. Inside of here, we're going to want to go ahead and get the marketplace service. So let's go ahead and create a variable for that. In addition to that, we're also going to want to get the shops config, so we can create a variable for that. And now, still relatively towards the top of this script, what we're going to do is create a brand new function. This function is going to be called update unlimited rebirths, and it's not going to have any parameters. Then inside of here, we're going to create a variable called clicks, which is going to be equal to the player's clicks. So state manager.getData.clicks. Now, after we've done that, we'll create our next variable, which is going to be called max rebirths. And the way that we're going to set this is using that function that we just created inside of the rebirths config. So we're going to say rebirths config.get max rebirths. And actually, let me create a variable for the player's current rebirths. So we're going to say local rebirths equals state manager.getData.rebirths. So now that we have that variable created, we're going to pass through the player's rebirths for that argument, and then we'll also pass through the player's clicks for the second argument as well. And now that we've calculated the max amount of rebirths that the player can actually afford, what we're then going to do is update the text of the unlimited button. And what we're going to set this to is we're actually going to use the rebirth button rebirth template string, and then we're going to use G sub on this, and we're going to replace the word amount with format number.format compact, and then we're going to pass through the max rebirths. So now that we have this function created, we can use this anytime we actually want to update the text of the unlimited button. Now there's also one more thing that we want to do to this function, and we want to do it towards the top of the function. What we want to do here is we want to check if the player owns the Game Pass before we actually update the unlimited button's text. So we're going to create a variable called has Game Pass, and of course that's going to be equal to shopconfig.doesPlayerOwn Game Pass. We'll pass through the unlimited rebirth buttons for the ID, and of course we'll pass through the state manager.getData for the second argument. Now if the player does not have that Game Pass, then we're actually going to stop the function right there. And now we're finished creating this function. Now let's think about when we would actually want to call this function. We probably want to call this function every single time the player receives more clicks, because that means it's possible for them to afford a new amount of rebirths. Now if we go down towards the bottom of our script, we actually are already listening to the update clicks remote event. and we're already calling a function which is the update buns buyable function. So we have two options here. One of our options would be doing the exact same thing that we do for the update buns buyable, but also for the brand new function that we just created. Or alternatively, what we could do is go inside of the update buns buyable function, and then after the for loop here, we can call the update unlimited rebirths function. So now every single time the update buns buyable function is called, we are also going to be updating the unlimited rebirths bun as well. Now that we've added that in, we also want to go to the very bottom of our script, and we also want to add in actually clicking on the unlimited rebirths bun. So we're going to say unlimited bun dot mouse bun one click :connect, and we're going to create an anonymous function inside of here. Now, the first thing we're going to want to do inside of here is get the Game Pass ID. So we'll create a variable for that, of course, called Game Pass ID, and that's going to be equal to the shop config.get Game Pass ID from name, and the ID that we want to get is of the Game Pass named Unlimited Rebirths Bun. Then we'll create a variable to check if the player actually owns the Game Pass. So we'll use the does player own Game Pass function once again. This time we'll pass through the Game Pass ID as well as the state manager.get data. Now, if the player does have the Game Pass and they click this bun, then what we want to do is we want to tell the server, hey, this player wants to rebirth this amount of times. And we can scroll up a little bit in the script to the generate bun function, and we can see what happens when we click on any of our rebirth buns. And when we click on any of these buns, we actually fire off a remote event called request rebirth with a number that indicates the amount of times that we do want to rebirth. So understanding that logic, we can use that exactly down here as well. Now, before we tell the server, hey, we want to rebirth this amount of times, we need to calculate the amount of times that we can actually rebirth. And we already did this in the newest function that we created. So what we can actually do is literally just copy all of that code right there and then paste it directly inside of here. So we're getting the player's clicks, we're getting their rebirths, and then we're determining the max amount of times that the player can actually rebirth. Now, after that, we want to check and make sure that max rebirths is greater than 0, because if it's 0, then that means that the player cannot afford any rebirths, so we don't even need to waste our time firing off this remote event. And now that we know that the player can rebirth at least one single time, what we're then going to do is fire off that remote event. So we're going to say remotes.request rebirth, fire server, and we're going to pass through the max rebirth number. And now that we've done that, inside of the same if statement, if has Game Pass, we're also going to add an else statement to this as well. And now if the player does not own the Game Pass and they click on this button, then we want to actually prompt them to purchase this Game Pass. So we're going to use the marketplace service, and of course we're going to use the prompt Game Pass purchase function. We'll pass through the player, and then we're also going to pass through the Game Pass ID as well. Now, one small mistake that I actually made, let's go back to the update unlimited rebirths function. And inside of here, we don't want to actually update the text of the unlimited bun. Of course we don't. For some reason, I feel like I forget this a lot. We actually want to update the text label that's inside of this bun called rebirths. So we want to update the text of that. And now that we've done that, we can go into our game and test this out. So hopping directly into our game, we can see that I'm currently able to afford about 20 rebirths. Let's go ahead and click on that bun and see that we now have rebirth 28 times. So that number is correct. But now I'm going to go ahead and build up some clicks off screen, and then I'll show you the unlimited rebirth bun updating each and every time. So now I'm able to afford one rebirth, and we can see that the unlimited rebirth buns has updated as well. And we can also see that I'm able to afford 2 rebirths, so the bun has updated again. Now I can afford 3 rebirths, 4 rebirths, and now we're quite close to approaching 5 rebirths, which is 25k. And we can see that once that bun is lit up for 5 rebirths, the unlimited bun is also updated to display 5 rebirths as well. So it seems like this system is working perfectly. If we rebirth, we can see that we are given that amount of rebirths. So it seems like everything right there is good to go. Now we'll begin implementing the 2 times clicks and gems game passes. Luckily for us, these game passes are pretty easy to implement. So to start, we're going to go inside of the replicated storage, inside of the utils folder, and open up the stats module script. Inside of here, we already have the click multiplier function, and we also have a luck multiplier function as well, which we've already implemented the game passes into. So implementing the game passes into the click multiplier function is going to be very easy. All we're going to do is between the multiplier and rebirth variable is create a brand new function called owns game pass. And that's of course going to be equal to the shop config.doesPlayer own game pass, and we'll pass through the 2 times clicks game pass as well as the player's data. Now, of course, if the player does own the Game Pass, then what do we do? Well, you guys already know. We're going to add 1 to the multiplier. Okay, cool. So that's all that we actually had to do for the click multiplier. Now what we're going to do to create the gem multiplier is we're just going to go ahead and copy and paste the click multiplier function. Of course, we'll rename this to the gem multiplier. And now for the name of this Game Pass, the name is actually 2 times rebirth gems. So we want to make sure that we update the string right there. And then pretty much all the logic after this if statement, we can delete, except for the return statement. So we want to make sure that we do leave that. Of course, if you want to modify the gem multiplier in any other ways in your own game, you could feel free to implement all of that code right inside of here. But now that we've created this multiplier and it's brand new, we need to implement this into our code base. Although for the click multiplier that we did just update, we don't actually have to add this in anywhere because we've already been using this in all of the areas where we want to. Now, where do we want to implement the gem multiplier at? Well, we actually want to implement that whenever a player rebirths. So inside of the server script service, we're going to go ahead and open up the rebirth module script. Inside of here, we're going to want to get the stats module script, and then we'll go inside side of the rebirth function. Now, after we decide if the player can afford to purchase the rebirth or not, and right before we actually reward them for their rebirths, what we're going to do is create a variable called gems multiplier. And what are we going to set this to? Well, of course, the stats.gem multiplier function will pass through the player as well as the profile.data. Now that we've gotten the gem multiplier, let's go ahead and calculate the amount of gems the player should receive. So now that we've created this variable, let's go ahead and do the math. And how do we do the math? Well, if we look at when we actually use the adjust gems function, we can see right here that we're multiplying the amount by 10. So let's go ahead and take this logic directly from there. And what we'll preemptively put inside of here is the gems variable that we're creating now. Now with that code that we've taken, what we're going to do is surround it in parentheses and paste it directly inside of here. So 10 times amount. And then after we do our usual calculation, what we're then going to do is also multiply it by the gem multiplier. Now, I'm not going to lie to you guys. I don't know if you need the parentheses here. You guys can probably tell the level of education I have on math is not great. All I know is that if we surround these in parentheses, it guarantees that this math will be done here before anything outside of it affects it. So that's why I put the parentheses there. But again, I'm not 100% sure if you need it. Either way, it doesn't really matter. But what does matter is that you leave a comment down below in the description reassuring me that you're also bad at math as well. I'm just kidding. Funny YouTuber moment. It's almost hard to not take those opportunities to say leave a comment down below. Anyway, with all that being said, we're actually completely done with implementing the gems multiplier. So now we can close out of both of those scripts. And now we can go into our game and test this out by rebirthing. So whenever we rebirth, we should actually receive 10 gems. But now that we own this Game Pass, that 10 should be multiplied by 2. So for one rebirth, we should be receiving 20 gems. Currently, we have 930. Let's go ahead and rebirth. And when we rebirth, we can see that we now have 950. So we know that that Game Pass has been implemented perfectly.